Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Larry Lynn, and I'm a contributor to the Social Science Curriculum Committee. Our team is happy to bring you today's session on the loneliness of being the Chief Justice Roberts. Please take out your cell phones, and as Ian said, right now, if you can, and ensure they are silenced so as to not distract from today's presentation. This afternoon, Tova Freedom's Her Story, Auschwitz. They will screen it. I think its title is Surviving Auschwitz, written by HASP member Milt Newsma. This free screening at the Knickerbocker Theater will be followed by a panel featuring the film's director, writer, and producers. We hope you can join us for both incredible events. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Ryden, who is well known by our HASP community. In today's session, he will focus on Chief Justice Roberts' leadership in the court, in particular, his careful nurturing of the court's institutional standing. Professor Ryden has a BA from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, a law degree from the University of Minnesota Law School, and a PhD from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ryden joined the Hope College Political Science faculty in 1994. He has published numerous books and articles on the Supreme Court, the electoral process, religious freedom, and other questions at the intersection of religion and politics. Professor Ryden and his wife have 4 children. His leisure activities, at least what I found on the website at Hope College a couple years ago, include enjoying his kids' exploits, as he would put it, coaching softball, teaching his kids piano, I'm not sure that's up to date, and on occasion standing in as a church musician. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Ryden.
Good afternoon. I need to update my biography on my Hope College website. It's been quite a few years since I coached my daughter's softball team. For a while, it said that I was a regular noon ball player at the Dow, the NBA, the Noon Ball Association. That's years in my past, as you can well tell. Our children, the number of children is always something in flux. And depending how you count, ranges from 3 to 6. We had three of our own children. The youngest is 16, and then 3 independent minor refugee children from various parts of the world who enriched our lives, certainly challenged them. The youngest of those just left home, so the empty nest syndrome is drawing close. But it's always a pleasure to be here at HASP. These are always fun. I invariably leave here, go back to the classroom, and tell my 18 to 20-year-old students what they're up against. Because you all are in the know, you're engaged, you follow what's going on, and they could take a lesson from that. I want to plug, did Ian leave the room? Okay, so I can put in the plug, good. Couple events that I'm doing, these will not conflict with HASP events, so I just want to bring these to your attention, and I'm going to see if Ian will share these with you. 2 weeks from today, October 30th, 7 o'clock in the evening, I am moderating a debate on the progressive prosecutor movement, which is an interesting phenomenon in American politics. And we have kind of a progressive prosecutor from the Ann Arbor area who's coming over to debate a judge from Berry County who was both a state and federal prosecutor, and that should be a lively event, 7 o'clock, the 30th. And then 2 weeks after that, November 30th, I'm hosting a lecture by Richard Garnett, who's a kind of nationally known scholar on religion and the Constitution from Notre Dame Law School. He's going to be talking on religion and the American constitutional experiment. So both of those, I know you HASP folks love to edify yourselves, and both of those should be good. So you are welcome. The 30th and the 13th, Monday and 2 months late, 2 weeks later, Monday and Monday. Yeah. All right. I was just walking over here and wondering kind of how to introduce myself in this moment, which is a topsy-turvy moment in our world. And I thought, well, it's in some of the topsy-turvy are things that give us joy. The Lions are in first place. And I say that as a Vikings fan, right? But way to go, Lions, the long-suffering Lion fan. My beloved Minnesota Twins have brought to a close what I think is undeniably the most egregious sports record for failure ever, which was in a baseball playoff, losing 18 playoff games in baseball in a row, which is just, it's almost beyond comprehension. But they brought it to an end. They won a series. They beat Houston last night to even the series. I am optimistic, which as a Minnesota fan almost ensures that my heart will be broken, right? By going public with my optimism, they are sure to crush it with morosity and failure soon to follow. But other topsy-turvy things are more dispiriting. We have a Congress that is incapable of functioning at any basic level of competence. We have a presidential election that is shaping up to give us two candidates who nobody seems to want, and yet it seems inevitable. And then there are topsy-turvy events that just weigh heavy on our hearts. And it's the violence and the war, the latest being just these horrific stories and images in Israel, what's going on in Ukraine. So I don't know what to say other than just, if you're a praying person, pray for these things and their release, and that they too shall pass. So, but that's not our focus today. Today it's the Supreme Court. Am I able to move this? Probably not. Okay, I'll leave it be. Right there. Okay, so I'll do my notes here. Yeah. So this is on the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court is back in session as of last week. It's 2023-24 docket was launched. In case you've not noticed, the court has been the subject and the focus of inordinate attention, not much of it positive. It's mostly been reports of ethical lapses among justices, public approval ratings plummeting to historic lows, and the swirl of opinionizing around controversial decisions on abortion, affirmative action, and religion. A corollary or subtext to much of the conversation and the news churning around the court has to do with concerns over its legitimacy and widening perceptions among the public that it is devolving from a court of law to an institution comprised of individual justices who are driven by baser political preferences and considerations. My aim with our sessions this week and next is to explore the issue of legitimacy of the U.S. Supreme Court, what we mean by it, why it especially matters in the context of the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court, and how we can think more clearly and have a better understanding of what is going on over the current debates and the seeming flagging of the court's legitimacy. And I want to do that through the lens of Chief Justice Roberts, someone who has, since he took his Chief Justiceship in 2005 and to the present, has elevated as one of his central aims the preservation, indeed the strengthening of the institutional standing and prestige, the public legitimacy, if you will, of the body that he leads. He's been a central figure for nearly 2 decades in the story of the court's legitimacy, and contemporary assertions of the collapse of the Supreme's legitimacy leave him looking like a historically forlorn and isolated figure. This is how things will unfold, what I hope to accomplish this week and next. I'm so glad we have 2 sessions because there's much to say. What I call the story in 4 parts. All right. Part number 1 is SCOTUS 101. Supreme Court of the United States 101, an introduction. I realized how many times I've appeared before HASP and other professional groups to talk about the Supreme Court, and I assume there's sort of a basic level of understanding. And that's probably not a safe assumption because the court tends to operate in the shadows. And so there's much that kind of even well-informed citizens don't necessarily understand. So I want to sort of offer a primer, kind of a basic introduction that will help us to kind of give us the foundation for what is then to follow, which will admittedly be more challenging and a bit denser. And we can't really understand Chief Justice Roberts' concerns with the court's legitimacy without understanding the political fractures that have developed over the past 4 decades in the federal judiciary and that have polarized and politicized the court, as evidenced by the confirmation hearings that now inevitably provide political high dudgeon and that serve only to make the court look like one more thoroughly partisan institution. So part 1, primer. Part 2 will lay out Chief Justice Roberts' commitment to, some might even say obsession with, enhancing the court's standing through greater consensus in the court's decisions and broadening the common ground among the competing blocks of justices. Roberts has explicitly made this his goal from the beginning with his confirmation hearing in 2005 and in various interviews that have followed. That objective has animated his chief judgeship throughout. Part 3, I want to examine the evidence pointing to the collapse of that legitimacy, at least in the eyes of the public, from which one might well conclude that the Chief Justice's efforts to preserve the court and its standing have imploded into abject failure. And finally, in part 4, I will attempt to answer the main question of why. And why do we account for this implosion of the court's public reputation, notwithstanding the Chief's nearly 2 decades of effort to do exactly the opposite. And in that part, I will offer kind of several competing ways of understanding judicial legitimacy. And I might suggest that the Chief's efforts, no matter how well-intended, were misguided and designed to fail, particularly in this polarized environment in which we find ourselves. So that's a long introduction. If you've attended mine before, you know I can't like talk for an hour and then have questions, right? I need breaks. And the older I get, the more I need breaks, okay? So I will stop periodically and say, what kind of questions do you have? And then we'll continue and there'll be some time left at the end. Always, if you have issues, if I say something that is obnoxious, objectionable, you want to push back, I love those. I love those questions and comments. So feel free. And if we have people online, and I can always repeat the question.
Yes, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Zoom doesn't work unless I have you use this. So,
okay. All right, on to the primer. Supreme Court 101, how does it work? For some of you, this will be old hat. For others, it may really be helpful. So I'll move through it fairly quickly, okay? How does the court work? The Supreme Court is a court of appeals, right? It only handles questions of law that come to it on appeal from lower courts, so it has appellate jurisdiction. The court has discretionary review. So it takes cases at its discretion. It chooses its own cases, and in the process, it shapes its own agenda. It gets somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 petitions a year and will accept roughly 1% of those cases. Last year, I think they gave a full hearing to 55 cases. So if you're wondering why the court is ruling on issues of such import and consequence, that's why. It has great power to set its agenda. It husbands its time and its resources by taking cases over which there are important conflicts, important differences, issues that tend to be really important to society or to markets or to various important actors and sectors of our world and our country. It has been rightly said, I think, that any issue of political import will invariably and inevitably find its way to the courts. Rule of 4, 5 to decide. Rule of 4, court needs 4 votes to take a case. 9 justices, 4 votes to take a case. 5 votes to win a case. A mere single vote between taking the case and winning the case. And that's a huge vote. That number 1 means an awful lot. Between 4 and 5, there operates a whole world of strategy and justices as strategic actors as they determine what cases to take, what's a vehicle for changing the law or establishing a precedent. That's a really important distance from 4 to 5. Okay. Once the court takes a case, it issues a writ of certiorari, or if you really want to impress friends at your dinner party, it's a writ of cert. Okay. They'll be impressed, I promise. After that, they take the case, then they set it on for a number of things. It starts with briefing, which are the written arguments of the parties. So the petitioner will file a written brief, their written argument. The respondent will file their brief. Each side will get reply briefs. And we have amicus curiae. You get that when you really impress them. Friends of the court. And friends of the court submitting their briefs. So other outside actors, not parties to the case, amicus or amici, depending how you want to pronounce it. And they are offering their view of things. So on the affirmative action case that the court decided last year, there were close to 100 amicus briefs. In the Dobbs case, the case that overturned Roe, there was 120 amicus briefs, right? Most cases don't have that many, but it's rare that a case will come before the court where there are not some of these outside amicus briefs. So briefing followed by oral argument. We could have a whole session on oral argument and what happens there. Anyone has traveled to Washington, D.C. and sat in on an oral argument? Oh, people. Okay, but there's nothing like the Supreme Court. It is like the single best thing to do. It is awesome. It is awesome. I will go when I go, and if it's a big case like it's like you know, standing in line for Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones tickets going on sale. Or a better analogy today would be Swiftie tickets, right? Like I'm in line at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. And those oral, they are just so cool. And so I'm leading our Hopes DC semester in the spring. The students and I will be attending oral arguments. So they will have one up on you. Shame on you all. Shame. That's a trip to make to DC just for that purpose alone. Oral arguments followed by conference. Conference is the 9 justices retiring to a conference room, just the 9 of them, no outside actors, voices, just the 9, confidentially discussing cases, taking a tentative vote. That's when they sort of tentatively decide the case, and the chief will assign the writing of the opinion to someone in the majority. Okay, and so there's a tentative drafter of the majority opinion. And here we get to what is the most drawn out and the most important aspect of the process, and kind of file this away when even if we don't get until next week to thinking about legitimacy and how the court does what it does, this business of opinion writing is unique. And it's extremely important, okay? It is through the opinion writing that the justices offer the rationale or justification for their decision. Why does that matter? Why do they do it when the president doesn't have to if he issues an executive order? Congress doesn't have to if they enact a piece of legislation. It's because of this anti-democratic or counter-majoritarian nature of the courts, embedded in a democratic system of governance. Okay, justices, right, unelected, life tenured, serving for life. Nowadays, that typically means 30 years or so. The average tenure for a Supreme Court justice, I think, is up to 28 and going higher all the time. Okay. Can't vote them out if we don't like what they do, right? We have Clarence Thomas on the court, right? He's left over from the George Herbert Walker administration. Okay. That's pretty anti-democratic, right? That's pretty anti-democratic. All right. And so it is this opinion writing that through which they convince us that these anti-democratic demigods in black robes are not acting on a whim, right? But they are in good faith trying to decide cases in alignment with the letter and spirit of the U.S. Constitution. Okay, unelected, life tenured judges, they don't get to decide things on a whim, right? So how do they give legitimacy to their decisions? They persuade us. They persuade us. And they write those opinions and they tell us why. And we carefully pore over those decisions, and we may be convinced or we may be skeptical. Right? But out of that process of opinion, it's a fascinating process. It's drafting by committee to some extent. You'll have a primary author who then he or she will pen a draft. It'll get circulated, and they are trying to bring others on board to join in their opinion. And how widely or narrowly they draft it may determine how broad or narrow is the consensus of judges or justices who are going to vote for them. Okay, so later on, when we talk about Chief Justice Roberts, who's trying to expand the consensus of the court, that's what he's talking about. And he's trying to get 9-0 decisions and 8-1 decisions rather than 5-4 decisions or 6-3 decisions. Okay, so this authorship of the majority opinion is centrally and fundamentally important. In cases, right, where there are disagreements, and there usually are, right? Easy cases don't make it to the court, right? All the cases are hard. And so you have the author of the opinion, again, making strategic decisions about how to write the opinion and how modest or restrained to get more consensus, more buy-in, or how dramatic and bold, right? And I just need 5, right? That these are really important decisions, and that go to the heart of how the court does its business. And we'll kind of see how that becomes like central as we go on with it. So that's kind of the process. Let me take a pause, as I said I would, have a sip of my tea, and just see if they're right. Right now, let's kind of limit questions just to the process, right? Kind of what I described, questions, things that are unclear or that need to be clarified.
As I understood it, you said there are people who are friends of the court who write these opinions for the judges to consider. What qualifies a person as a friend of the court?
Yeah, and the friend of a court, it's a Latin term. So amicus curiae, friend of the court, is what it stands for. And I don't mean, my chum who lives next door to the Supreme Court justice, or they're sipping bourbon and cigars after hours. Not that kind of friend. Okay, it's a term of art that means people who have an interest in the issue that's being decided. Okay, and so right on the abortion issue, right, there were sort of pro-life groups and pro-abortion rights groups, right? NARAL, Emily's List might be on the pro-abortion rights side, right? National Right to Life Committee, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, right? Just as examples. Okay. I've been a signatory to several amicus briefs. These were briefs. The issue had to do with election law, political parties, candidates, and election law. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on. It became a book. You know, I kind of had a little 15 minutes in the limelight when Bush v. Gore was going on. And I was a part of a group of political scientists who advanced a particular point of view on some issues that came before the court that had to do with parties and election law. Kind of obscure issues that only we kind of nerdy political science types would be interested in. But we thought the court needed to decide in one way. So one of ours was a high-powered Washington lawyer who wrote a brief kind of putting forth our view, and we submitted it as a friend of the court brief. Does that help? Yeah, good. Good question.
We have one question online. Who decides how many justices serve on the court? How did we get to 9?
Good. Congress does. So as we think about, right, here's SCOTUS 101 or, right, civics, junior high civics, checks and balances, right? And each branch has means of checking the other branches. And one of the modes that Congress has for checking the court is they control things like judicial structure of the federal judiciary. They have the power to create new judgeships. They can regulate jurisdiction and the types of cases that the court can or cannot take. So Congress has the power to alter the size of the court and has in fact done so a number of times. But it all happened between 1791 and 1869, I think was the last time they did it. Okay. Sometimes it was in response to political events and you wanted to shrink or expand the court for political reasons. They just sort of settled on 9 in 1869. And that has simply become what I would say a norm, right? A long established custom or norm now. So, right, if you follow, and we might talk a little bit about court packing. And Democrats, as the court has turned more conservative, right? The Democratic Party has talked about packing the court. And by that, they mean legislation to create additional seats on the court, which then a Democratic president could name and a Democratic Senate could confirm. And voila, you have a Democratic majority, right? And given the 6-3 conservative majority right now, we create 4 additional seats. Okay, really bad idea. Right, really bad. Even if they have the formal kind of constitutional power to do it, right? That is now a pretty well established norm. And whenever that's talked about, right, usually there's a pretty significant backlash and an uproar, and then they realize, no, that probably is not a good idea. So they could, even though it's really not wise. Okay. Yes.
Just a quick process question. You indicated that after the oral arguments, the justices go into conference. What's the time gap between? Is it the same day? Is it a week later, a month later?
No, it is fairly soon after. And so it kind of depends on when oral arguments are. At one point, they would hold conference on the Friday at the end of the week when they would have oral arguments. Now I think that has been expanded to Wednesdays and Fridays, not every week. As the court's docket has shrunk, so they used to hear a couple hundred cases a year. Now it's down to maybe 60 or so. As their docket has shrunk, they don't have that many oral arguments. So the oral argument schedule has shrunk a little bit, but it's sort of Wednesdays and Fridays fairly soon after. So that happens quickly. And then the opinion writing, that takes a long time, especially if they're big cases. Usually they all come out the last week or two of the term, which is latter part of June, or maybe even the first week of July. Yep. One more, and then we'll continue on.
I think I'm next in line. But
sorry, Peg. Yeah.
One is a plea. Talk about the 18-year. You're the first person that I ever heard that. I've heard it once since, and I think it's a great idea. The question I have, though, is what happens to the appeals that are not taken to fruition?
Sure. What happens to appeals that the Supreme Court does not take? Then the circuit court is the court of last resort, right? And so the federal structure at trial courts, kind of, I always describe it to my students, it's a pyramid, right? And the bottom foundation, that's the trial courts. That's where they have original jurisdiction, right? Trial jurisdiction. District courts, we call them in the federal courts. State courts are structured the same way, okay? And so that's where cases start. That's where you try a case. You have witnesses, testimony, documentary evidence, right? And you have facts that come in, and then you have a fact finder, either a jury or a judge, who decides what the facts are. The judge gives them the law. They apply the law to the facts, and you have a result. Then that goes up to the Intermediate Court of Appeals, which is what we call the circuit court. Okay, in the federal courts, it's this, not to be confused with Michigan's circuit courts that are a trial court. Okay, so don't get too bound up. And if you really want to be confused, you go to the state of New York, where they're trial courts. They call them Supreme Courts, just to confuse you. So they're different in every state, but think trial courts, intermediate appeal, Supreme Court appeal. Okay, intermediate courts do not have discretionary appeal by and large. They have a discretionary review. They have mandatory review. So typically you lose at the trial court, you are entitled to one bite at the apple on appeal. Okay, circuit court, federal circuit court, right? You lose there, you have to file a petition for certiorari, a petition for cert, right, to the Supreme Court, 1%. That means arguably, we can fight about this if you want, right? That the most important courts in our country are at least in the federal system, are the circuit courts. They're the courts of last resort in the overwhelming number of cases. And given how few cases the Supremes take, right, that they have great influence and power. Yeah, good. All right. Giddy up, let's continue. All right, so there's process. Now we all are experts on how the court operates. Now we're going to do just a little sort of quick history of the court that is necessary to understand how we got to where we are today. All right, and this is sort of my Cliff Notes version of history. Right. This is how my Hope College freshman daughter is learning things. She is home for fall break and she's talking about how she's learning and all the shortcuts she's taking. And I've decided I failed miserably. But here I am, kind of the Cliff Notes version, only because we only have the time to do that. Okay. And so I'm going to focus on what I call the modern era, or the era of the modern court. Okay, and the modern court really sort of developed alongside the New Deal of the 1930s and the 1940s. So the modern era is about 100 years old or 90 years old. Okay, and dramatic changes in the essence of the modern court in the mid 20th century mirrored or moved parallel to the dramatic changes that the New Deal kind of wrought regarding the expansion of federal power and the constitutional basis for that expansion of power, right? So FDR from 1933 to 1945, president for 13 years, was able to make a court and to remake a court wholly in his image. Okay, not through his much maligned and misguided court packing plan that he tried in 1937. He was frustrated with all these ancient members on the court who kept slapping down his New Deal legislation, and he thought he would get all his pals in the Senate to expand the size of the court. He got some to introduce a plan into the U.S. Senate. The plan would create an additional seat for every justice who was over, I think, 70 years of age, which would have given him at least 4 additional justices just like that. This was the rare kind of FDR misstep, completely blew up in his face. Backlash at every level. The public hated it. Congress hated it. Democrats in the Senate hated it, right? And it didn't go anywhere, but that's fine because he was like, he was like a monarch for 12 years. And in that time frame, he was able to pick 8 members to the court. So he basically remade the court. Okay. And what was he doing? I mean, he was going to do it his objective. And so this is court packing kind of the old fashioned way, which every president does. Okay. He didn't fill it with judges from the state Supreme Court or the federal circuit court. He filled it with Pauls, with members of the Senate, his pals in the Senate, right? And his one objective was that they were going to be on board with giving sort of a constitutional imprimatur to New Deal legislation. And they were happy to oblige. Okay. And so in the business of, or in order to kind of provide the constitutional rationalization for doing that, these senators turned Supreme Court justices needed to be more creative, shall we say, in their approaches to interpreting the Constitution. And in finding ways to uphold the historically greater expansion of power that was the New Deal. And they did so. Okay. And so in that process, they really did start the remaking of the mode, kind of the dominant or regnant mode of interpreting, reading, and applying the Constitution. Okay. And so in about a decade, the court was remade. And not very long thereafter, sort of the central mode of constitutional practice was being reshaped in a really significant way. And so the natural progression from the FDR court of the late 30s and the 40s would fairly quickly lead to the Warren court in the late 50s and the 60s on. What we know to be the pinnacle of kind of liberal constitutionalism in the Supreme Court. At the same time that was happening, you had sort of parallel development in the legal academy. And you had law professors kind of moving in the same direction. And there, and kind of a parallel development in a relatively short period of time, our nation's law schools were likewise sort of affirming and siding with what this new kind of Supreme Court was doing in terms of constitutional practice. And so by the time we get to the 1970s, so this is really something of a constitutional kind of revolution that happens in about 3 decades. Okay. And by the 1970s, we have what is largely kind of a monolith between the federal judiciary and law school academy, the legal academy. Okay. And it's pretty much kind of liberal, kind of fluid interpretation, expansive ways of kind of reading contemporary values into the Constitution. A lot of the big cases, that came out of the Warren court, we would be familiar with. Okay. So that's a development up to the 1970s. Then we have the seeds of a conservative counter movement. And those seeds were first sown with the Nixon presidency. Okay, so late 60s, early 70s. And they happened with Nixon's effective use of the liberal Warren court as his political foil, and his appointing of Justices Powell, Rehnquist, and Berger to the High Court. And these were more conservative justices. From 1969 to 1991, Republican presidents made 10 consecutive appointments to the Supreme Court. Once again, the poor bad luck of the hapless Jimmy Carter, plagued him even in terms of the courts, and no picks, for President Carter. This run of Republican appointments proved much less successful than FDR's in the attempt to reconstitute the court in a conservative mold. Justices like Ford appointee John Paul Stevens and Bush I's appointee David Souter turned out to be liberal jurists in Republican clothing. Reagan appointees O'Connor and Kennedy grew increasingly unreliable, at least in the estimation of conservatives, the longer they served on the court, especially as each came to occupy the median swing vote on what gradually came to be an evenly divided court. Nevertheless, the liberal tide on the court had been stemmed. The changes on the court's makeup began to inch back kind of towards an equilibrium or a balance between liberal and conservative blocs on the courts. All right. one other profound development that warrants our attention, and that's the establishment of the Federalist Society in 1982, the year I entered law school, by the way. And I remember a Federalist Society chapter on the University of Minnesota Law School's campus. I put in here my notes because I specifically remember this, that they were sort of at the outset viewed as kind of a fringe group of conservative cranks. But over time, they may be, but they have much more power, right? Over time, they would grow into a legal powerhouse, anchoring a highly organized and well-funded network of conservative groups, serving as a breeding ground for a generation of conservative legal thinkers, many who would go on to serve in the federal judiciary. For example, 5 members of our current court either are or have been or were members of the Federalist Society. Okay. The Federalist Society gets most, if not all, of the credit for the one dramatically successful policy area for President Trump, which was remaking conservative court and a conservative judiciary, because he had the wisdom to not do it himself. And so he really did. He sort of offloaded it to the Federalist Society. Leo Leonard was the person who took a sabbatical from the Federalist Society to lead that effort. So that was happening in a fascinating story in sort of organization building. And people have often wondered sort of where's the liberal kind of counterpart? And we could have an interesting kind of sidebar on that. But kind of think of the dynamics, right? That the Federalist Society and this conservative movement was coming out of sort of being very marginalized, really coming from kind of the fringes of the regnant kind of constitutional liberalism that was the story of the day. And so liberals have never, and they have had kind of the law schools at their disposal, so never quite had the motivation or sort of the ideological coherence really to generate a counter movement. And that's a really fascinating, a little beyond our kind of what we're talking about here today, but that's interesting. Over time, the opportunity for Republican presidents to nominate new justices, bolstered by the expertise and counsel of the Federalist Society and associated conservative groups, yielded results. By the end of the Reagan-Bush presidencies, a new reality had set in at the High Court, one in which there were 2 competing and about sort of evenly balanced blocks of justices, 1 conservative, 1 liberal, with substantially divergent views of how to read and apply the Constitution, especially on sort of the hot button issues that generated controversy, that captured the attention of the broader culture and the political world. So the result was this evenly balanced court, first with Sandra Day O'Connor holding the coveted swing vote, deciding which way the tough cases would turn, and then her giving way upon retirement to the mercurial Anthony Kennedy, who grew to be increasingly sort of unpredictable once he settled into the center. Okay, that's a real quick Cliff Notes history. So I'm going to take a pause and have more tea. Questions? Again, focusing on that kind of history. John, if you say your question, I can certainly repeat it here.
Quick, I'm in a minority opinions.
Say that again.
Minority opinions.
From the court, so dissenting opinions. Yeah, so good. Because I neglected to talk about the different kinds of opinions that come from the court, right? So particularly if the court is not 9-0, right? Someone's in the dissent, and so frequently, oftentimes, if it's not a unanimous decision, you'll have a dissenting opinion, right? And so those who would have voted the other way, and it could be one or more, right? On the big cases, everyone has to write a decision, and so you have the majority opinion. You might have one or multiple dissenting opinions, and then we have concurring opinions. Concurring opinions are those who voted with the majority, but would have used sort of different argument to get there. Okay, and remember, arguments matter, right? With the Supreme Court, arguments matter. So the classic example there is the Dobbs case that overturned Roe v. Wade, right? And John Roberts' behavior in that case. And so you had at issue Missouri, I always forget whether it was Mississippi or Missouri, the state, anyway, it was a 15-week kind of ban on abortions, a state law, I think it was Mississippi. And so, right, that 15 weeks differed from the Roe standard of viability, which by the time the Dobbs case came along was 24 weeks. Okay, so someone challenged the Mississippi statute saying it's unconstitutional because it doesn't align with Roe. Okay, and the conservative justices disagreed. Okay, and so they voted to uphold that Mississippi statute. Okay, they voted to uphold it by a 6-3 vote. Okay, John Roberts joined with the majority voting to uphold the statute. John Roberts wrote a concurring opinion. And his concurring opinion was he did not want to go as far as the other 5 went, i.e. to explicitly overturn Roe v. Wade. Okay, and so he wrote a concurring opinion. He said, no, let's not be so bold. Like I agree, let's uphold the statute, but we don't need to overturn Roe. We don't need to go that far. And he was unsuccessful. Here's one example, right? Here's a hint of what's coming. An example of his loneliness, right? Trying to argue that the court should be more moderate, be more incremental in its change, try to build more consensus around a position that is less bold, more incremental, more measured, more kind of middle of the road. Was unsuccessful in convincing anyone to do that. Okay, so that's an example of a, right, majority concurring dissenting opinion. Okay, good. Yes, and I can repeat it if needed.
We have a question online first.
Okay.
So as Supreme Court being a court of appeals, how is it that Bush v. Gore case went directly to the Supreme Court?
Good. It did not. It did not. So it got there very quickly, but it didn't go there directly. Okay. Right. Everything in Bush v. Gore was weird. Right. It broke all the rules because you had a presidential election, right, kind of hanging in the balance, and time was of the essence. So it happened in 5 weeks, from election day to the Monday evening when the reporters were trying to figure out what the opinion said on the steps of the Supreme Court. Do you remember those images? It was hilarious. 5 weeks, right? It happened in 5 weeks. So just everything was accelerated. Okay. But it did go through something of an appeals process. What happened there, right? It went through the state courts. It went through the state courts. And because the Supreme Court determined there was a federal constitutional question, that the state Supreme Court decision of Florida then was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, twice. First time they decided not to decide, sent it back to the state Supreme Court with some very clear signals on kind of what they had done wrong, which the state Supreme Court chose to ignore, and it kind of ended back at the Supreme Court. So it did file the process. It was just everything was expedited. Yes.
The influence of people like Newt Gingrich, and how much influence do they have on the court or something like that?
What is it about someone like Newt Gingrich that makes you think he has influence?
I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know why he would.
They seek people with opinions.
The Supreme Court? Well, no, I mean, it's lawyers, right? It's a Supreme Court bar. It's a very elite group of lawyers who tend to argue before the court. So John Roberts, I think, had argued 30-some cases before the Supreme Court before he was elevated to the high court. I mean, he was universally regarded as kind of one of the top-notch, right, Supreme Court bar lawyers. Implicit in your question is a question about the Supreme Court and who they listen to, and do they listen to sources beyond kind of legal sources. And again, that's like a big question. Right? We tend to have this view of the court, right? It's judging. It's an objective, right? John Roberts is, when we get into his story, I'll cite a little bit of his testimony in his confirmation hearing, which was he likened himself and his fellow members of the court to umpires. Balls and strikes. That's all they're doing. They're calling balls and strikes, right? It's objective. There's the strike zone. Right. And right there it is. And you call balls and strikes. You know, it's a pretty objective matter. If you believe that, yeah, got some property across from the Supreme Court building to sell you. Right. Nobody quite believes that. So they're really, I don't know how much I should go into this, right? But just real quick. They're kind of competing schools of understanding how the court does what they do. Right. And there is this kind of formalist view of things. It's objective, right? And judges are judges. They're trained the same way. They'll decide things the same way. They'll look at the history of what was behind a provision of the Constitution or a statute. They read the text, right? And most judges will sort of arrive at the same place. It's kind of formalist, and they call it formalism, okay? Or that's kind of the legal model, right? Yeah, nobody really quite buys that anymore, right? Then we have the extra, what we call the attitudinal model. Okay, again, you throw this term around, you'll really impress people, right? The attitudinal model is what it says, what you would think, right? That justices fall back on sort of attitudes and extra legal or political considerations, right? So personal preferences do kind of play a part. Philosophical viewpoints, policy outcomes, a desired policy outcome, right? A number of things that we view as extra legal. And justices are shaped by those. And I think no one who watches the court carefully would suggest otherwise, right? And the question is, how much, right? How much of a role does that play? And right, the cynics would say, it's all attitudinal, it's all personal preferences. And there they might listen to political voices, right, and try and take the measure of what they have to say. And there's lots of history of Supreme Court justices who did exactly that, and they picked up the phone, right? So Abe Fortas, who ended up on the court, who had been a high-level advisor of Lyndon Johnson when Johnson was president, like he continued to advise the president directly, like in the room, even as he was a member of the court, right? That just seems a little unseemly, right? It happens in a little more wink, wink, nod, nod sort of way. But I think that's kind of what is that fair to say? Okay, good. A couple more questions before we move on.
You have one online. Was Antonin Scalia a member of the Federalist Society?
I think so. Don't bet on that, but I'm pretty sure he was. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time, given what you're describing about the history. Could you comment about the paradox of the Republican Senate refusing to act on Merrick Garland's nomination and then rushing to get the other one done at the end of the Trump presidency?
Yeah, I'm gonna put that one on hold, okay? Because we're gonna get there. We'll get to some of it maybe today, and then we'll do more next week, because it's an interesting one, and it's one that has prompted a lot of anger, right? At this court, a lot of questions of legitimacy. There's also a pretty significant backstory, per usual, when it comes to the courts and appointments. There's all sorts of blame to go around. No one comes at it with clean hands. So, and if I somehow forget, I won't. If I do, make sure I remember. Yeah, that was the question. Okay. Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So the one other, and actually we may get there now, because the other storyline that I want to mention really does kind of involve the politicizing of the court, the hyper politicizing of the court through the erosion and the breakdown of the confirmation process. Okay. And so remember, right, here's the context, right? We have two competing blocks of justices on the court, deeply divided by philosophical and jurisprudential differences, and those differences playing out on the court as it finds itself in the middle of high stakes cases, picking a president in Bush v. Gore, right? Campaign finance in Citizens United, gun rights in the Heller case, right? The omnipresent abortion rights, place of religion in public life, affirmative action, voting rights, and I could go on and on and on, right? And so the result of that is a transformed confirmation process, morphing into an intense hothouse partisan kind of battleground that essentially served to portray the court and its members as partisan pawns. And so I'm going to start in 1987. And many of you may remember that moment as the Robert Bork moment, okay? And so that was, I would argue, was a pretty significant shifting of the ground under the feet of those doing the appointment and the confirmation process in the Senate. And that was Ronald Reagan's nomination of Robert Bork, okay? To this point, up until that point, the norm was senatorial deference to presidential choice. Okay, senatorial deference to presidential choice. Unless a scandal emerged or the candidate was obviously unqualified, right? The norm was that even if the Senate was held by the other party, the norm was that by and large you defer to the president and his prerogative in choosing who he gets to choose. Okay, and that would change with Bork. All right, at least the beginning of the changes that would take place fairly soon thereafter. Bork was an interesting figure. He was a deeply consequential figure. He was very conservative. He was widely published, unlike anybody who wants to get on the court now, and they take great care to not leave any kind of paper trail. Not Robert Bork, right? He published and he published and he published. And unlike anyone who wants to get on the Supreme Court and now goes into a confirmation hearing and spends lots of words saying absolutely nothing, Robert Bork went before the Senate and answered everything substantively. I remember thinking, like, this is a fascinating civics lesson. Like it was like incredibly substantive. Okay, he should have known better. He should have known better, right? He was sort of viewed as kind of a godfather of the originalist movement. He was an intellectual giant. I don't think anyone believed that he intellectually, his experience, his just what he brought to the table was not supremely qualified to sit on the court. But for those very reasons, he was a really dangerous figure to the left. Okay, and his appointment was a significant appointment. It is what we call a transformative appointment, and I may have used that term in this room before, meaning his appointment was such that it would shift the balance of the court. Okay, that he clearly was going to be a conservative, an originalist, and a leader of that bloc. And he was replacing someone who's kind of a soft, mushy kind of center person. And the balance was such that he was going to tip it to the conservative side. Okay, a transformative appointment. And that was unacceptable. And so Democrats proceeded to bork him, okay, to eviscerate him, to reduce him to a caricature, and he made it easy to do, such that the word getting borked, right, entered the political lexicon. So now if someone's being vetted publicly for a seat in the judiciary or some other federal seat that requires Senate confirmation, and they are sort of reduced to a cardboard cutout figure, they have been borked. Okay, and I just love Teddy Kennedy. He sort of opened the proceedings with his speech from the floor of the Senate, and it was a masterclass in demagoguery. and really just sort of presaged what was coming. So Robert, and I can picture it. Like, I was nerdy enough even back then to watch these hearings. Robert Bork's America's one where, quote, women would be forced into back alley abortions. Blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters. Rogue police would break down citizens' doors in midnight raids. School children could not be taught about evolution. Writers and artists could be censored at the whim of the government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens, unquote. And Kennedy sort of set the tone, what was to follow, which was a 2-week assault on Bork. And by the end, he was radioactive. Okay. Senate voted against him 58-42. I think that remains the largest sort of negative vote that anyone has received who's been rejected by the Senate. And I would argue that was something of a watershed as we look at kind of the confirmation process. It was an event Republicans would not soon forget. Certainly the scales fell off on how the other side, what they would resort to keep a formidable presence off the high court. Here I have parentheses, and we might come back to this if you're wondering where the seeds of the McConnell-led Republican refusal 3 decades later to even give Obama appointing Merrick Garland a hearing, one might start here. Okay, it was an event from which Democrats learned that this high stakes take no prisoners approach could work, and it's been replicated in hearings since then. And I would argue it marked the beginning of the end. It didn't mark the end, but it marked the beginning of the end of real deference to the executive and his constitutional prerogative. And it really ushered in an age of confirmation hearings reduced to pitched partisan battles, which now mark every confirmation hearing. And so and like I said, it didn't happen immediately, but it happened relatively quickly. So you can compare votes to sort of judicial figures whose names we recognize from that time to votes that would happen a decade later and beyond. So John Paul Stevens, right? And so the context of John Paul Stevens, nominated by, right, a president with no political capital, in the wake of Watergate, right? Actually wrote an article on Ford's decision here. It was sort of a master political decision as he was tiptoeing through minefields that could easily have blown up on him. Stevens confirmed in the Senate 98-0. Okay. Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981 confirmed 99-0. Okay. Antonin Scalia, that conservative devil right, confirmed 98-0. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that liberal off the left end of the spectrum, 96-3. Okay, that's deference, right? That's deference by the other party. Clarence Thomas in 1991, right? This one, I mean, there was scandal around it, right? So that colors it, but 52-48. 52-48. John Roberts in 2005, I would argue one of the most clearly qualified ever to be nominated to the court, 78-22. Okay. Sam Alito, 58-42. Ketanji Brown Jackson, most recently, 53-47. Okay. And now any nominee who's put forth routinely will attract near universal opposition of the other party with 45, 47, 48 votes. So that's where we are now. Okay. So let me stop there and we can sort of talk about right, President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland. And so the history there begins in February of 2016, right? February of 2016, when, right, you open the newspaper and there the shocking headline is Antonin Scalia has died of a heart attack, I think, kind of out of nowhere, right? So February 2016, i.e. kind of tail end of the Democratic President Obama's presidency. Okay, president acts fairly quickly, and by March, he has nominated Merrick Garland. And Merrick Garland was actually, I remember at the time thinking he was something of a fig leaf that the president kind of extended towards Republicans. He was well into his 60s. And by this time, right, given the fight over the ideological control of the court, presidents were now routinely nominating people in their 40s, maybe their early 50s. Why? To maximize the time you have them on the court doing your thing, right? And so he put Merrick Garland forward. He was like 60 something. Wow. And he was not hard left. He was a liberal, but he was like a sensible liberal on the court. But it also would have been what kind of appointment? There we go. A transformative appointment, right? This would have shifted the balance of the court from, right, Anthony Kennedy, wobbly, sort of unpredictable Anthony Kennedy. So you actually had 4-4, and like Kennedy probably leaned right more than left, but sort of unpredictable. Okay, so 4-4 and maybe 1 here. Okay, right. So if Scalia, who's clearly in the conservative bloc, he goes down, right? And you add Merrick Garland, so even if he's 4 and maybe here, right? It's 4 strong liberal and a pretty liberal versus 3 and 1 mushy one, right? Transformative opinion, balance in the left direction, right? And so Mitch McConnell, majority leader of the Senate, Republican, he looks at that and it's like, I'm not going to grease the skids for a liberal majority on the court. He does what anybody would have done in that environment. He uses power to, and of course he dresses it up in Democratic terms. We've got an election coming in November. Isn't this something that the people really need to speak on? That was his rationale, his justification. And so poor Merrick Garland, he, you know, kind of twisting in the wind, no action, right? No action. And then lo and behold, November happens, right? November happens. Nobody predicted it, right? But there you go. And so instead of Garland, right, we get Gorsuch. We get a pretty conservative kind of originalist justice. So it's not a transformative appointment. It's sort of what we call a reinforcing appointment. It kind of reinforces the balance that was. Okay, then you jump forward 4 years to October, I think October 2020. So, right, Trump is is up for re-election in a month, a little over a month. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been immune to the pleas by Democrats everywhere to please, please step down. They were pleading that she would step down during the Obama administration. She had had a history of health problems. She was becoming very frail. She'd had cancer several times. And she was immune to those pleas. So she continued on the court and then passed away early October, I think. Now, being the principled politician that he was, I mean, we all know the story, right? Mitch McConnell said, well, the election's coming, so we'll leave that open, right, till election day. No, that's not how it works, right? What does he do, right? Trump quickly nominates Amy Coney Barrett. McConnell quickly, right, sort of puts hearings together. They're very quick, and she's sworn in October sometime, I think. Right. And so that certainly created among Democrats like a sense of unfairness, right? Traitor, how could he do that? Right. It's all about power. Of course, it's all about power. Right. And that's not a surprise. Right. And so when I say not everyone comes with hands clean, multiple examples where Democrats, when they had power, did the same thing. OK, Miguel Estrada, does that name mean anything to anyone? No. You know why? Because the Democrats gave him the very same treatment that the Republicans gave Merrick Garland. Okay, he had been nominated, George W. Bush. So this was the early 2000s. Democrats held the Senate. He had been nominated to a federal circuit court judgeship. So not Supreme Court, circuit court, right? What is typically the court of last resort. He had Supreme Court written all over him. Hispanic, very conservative, whip smart. Everyone had him pegged. This is a temporary stop at the circuit court, and he's being elevated as soon as the next opening happens on the Supreme Court. Democrats saw it too, and they said this guy's not going to see the light of day, and so he sat. Right, no hearings, and he went back to being a law professor, I think. John Roberts, when he came to the Supreme Court in 2005, right? That was not his first involvement in being nominated to be a federal judge. That actually goes back to 1991, I believe, when George Herbert Walker Bush, no, it couldn't have been, it had to be a little later than that. I forget when it was. Anyway, a number of years earlier, he'd been nominated by a Republican with a handful of judges to be either district court or circuit court judges. Okay, fairly late in the president's term, Democrats held the Senate. They did nothing. Right, they did nothing. John Roberts went back into private practice, became a very good Supreme Court lawyer, eventually got the nod later on, right? So yeah, right, it's understandable sort of. So when we, like next week, when we start thinking about legitimacy and right, especially concerns kind of on the Democratic side, that this court is illegitimate, that stories like that and Merrick Garland certainly feed that perception and that sense of unfairness. It's always more complicated than that because the Senate, they will use the power the way they use the power, especially in this, right, this closely divided time where we find ourselves in terms of the court. Does that kind of help? Yeah, this is again really a fascinating area. Merrick Garland and others before him, kind of casualties of a polarized court and a politicized confirmation process. Yeah. All right, let's pause. In fact, we have about 15 minutes. We might stop here and see what kind of questions. Yes.
What is your attitude toward term limits, and is there any traction for it in the Congress?
So the question is term limits for the court. What do I think about it, and is there any hope for some traction? I am on record as liking the idea. I like the idea. Why? Because it takes the randomness out of the openings that occur on the courts, right? So we want courts and judges to be apolitical. We want them to be insulated from politics by and large, right? And yet there should be some connection, right? Remember I call it anti-majoritarian or counter-majoritarian, anti-democratic, life tenured, unelected, serving for 30 years, right? But they are embedded in a democratic system. And so I would argue, right, there has to be some kind of democratic connection that happens in the form of presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. That's where we get sort of the democratic link. It's a soft one, but it's something. But when you have justices who are now serving 30, 35, I mean, Clarence Thomas will probably, I think he's up to 34 years, and he'll probably set the record, right? Unless health issues or something afflict him. I just lost my train of thought. Oh, right. So what undermines that is certainly when they're serving 35 years or more, right? Going back to a 1991 nomination, right? And that democratic connection is further and further and further removed. And so if we do acknowledge this attitudinal way in which the court decides things, then we might want to sort of limit or make sure that democratic connection is there. Right now, it happens by pure happenstance. right? So Ruth Bader Ginsburg happens to pass away, right? While Trump is still president, he gets to pick her. He gets to pick a replacement, right? We have Jimmy Carter, who serves 4 years, and Donald J. Trump, who serves 4 years. The former gets 0 picks, the latter gets 3 picks, right? That's randomness. It's kind of the randomness of history, right? And it really is utterly removed from any sort of democratic connection. Okay, so the talk has been around this idea of an 18-year, a single 18-year term. Okay, and that makes sense from what I just described, which is this connect. So it still matters, like this in terms of sort of democracy, right? It's still, you're still going to go out and win presidential elections. And so there still is a reward for the person who wins the presidential election. But it means Supreme Court appointments will sort of track presidential elections because you're getting one every 2 years, right? So every president's going to get 2 picks, right? And it's not random. And it rewards those who are out there winning the approval of the public in presidential elections. And so that's sort of a nice kind of neat way in which it plays out. Some have said, well, but wouldn't you need to amend the Constitution? I think that's open for debate. You couldn't take a justice who hits the 18th year and just put him out to pasture because they have life tenure. They serve for good behavior. The argument is they do not necessarily serve on the Supreme Court for good behavior, right? So Sandra Day O'Connor, David Souter, they still hear cases. Right, they still hear cases in a semi-retired state, but they've right either as district court or circuit. It simply means right, you get to your 18-year end of your term and you move off the Supreme Court. You go back to the circuit court, district court, and continue to hear cases. I haven't taken a deep dive into that, so. And just because I like the idea, maybe I'm convincing myself it doesn't need a constitutional amendment. I know myself well enough to know I'm captive to my own biases. I don't know, among pointy-headed academics, but nobody listens to us. So I don't know. I don't know how it gains traction. The other thing is, I don't know what it would mean for sort of for the Senate's confirmation role, right? That if the president, right, if it's 18-year term limits, president is entitled to 2 picks or 1 pick each 2 years, you'd have to have some way of trying to sort of re-infuse the Senate's role with kind of the default is to confirm, right? Unless there are some strong reasons to do otherwise. So I don't know how that would handle. I think her hand was up first and then we can go over here. Yep. The Senate's advise and consent role. And that is what the Senate says it is, right? The Senate, under the Constitution, president gets to nominate pursuant to the Senate's advise and consent. What does that mean? Like any number of constitutional provisions, it's kind of means what you want it to mean. But that's where the authority comes from, right? And both sides have used it, right? In terms of advise and consent, well, we can exercise that or we can choose not to do it, right? Well, politically, oh, absolutely, sure. But each side does it, right? Everybody does it. We don't like it, right? Of course, especially when they're doing it to our side, for crying out loud. But advise and consent, it's kind of one of these buzz phrases of the Constitution that is not sort of readily apparent. Its meaning isn't readily apparent. And right, who holds the power is going to use it to their advantage, no matter how frustrating it may be, right? Well, they had a Republican majority. They had a Republican majority in the Senate. So he had the Senate. He had the Senate. A majority of the Senate were going to back him up on that. Yeah.
Is there any hope of ethics reform for the court?
Oh, people like this issue. You all are just so, so self-righteous. It's like, you're all just so ethical. Yeah. They may have to at some point bow to public pressure for some sort of ethics reform. It strikes me that it won't be earth-shaking. It might be a way of trying, right? Next week, we'll talk about kind of public perception of the court. And that's, yeah, it's kind of unseemly when they're taking large gifts and trips and that sort of thing. I'm sure I'm a complete contrarian saying it doesn't bother me much. If you could kind of show me direct links between gifts and decisions, right? But these people, they're strong legal minds, right? Right. So typically what we talk about is kind of perceptions, right? So there are improprieties and then there are perceptions of impropriety. And you're kind of talking about the perception, right? And how your normal you think there are real ethical issues like that translate into outcomes that show favoritism. Because I think that kind of, I'm sorry, I interrupt. I think that piece is missing. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was not so much referring to gifts as the character of the people that are nominated.
Oh, so for Robert Bork, you had Democrats who were subpoenaing his rental history from Blockbuster. Okay, so my point being, these people are not coming in without anybody's knowledge of their character. They are under the magnifying glass. I'm not concerned about sort of character issues. Yeah, if there are significant ones, I think that'll come out and they won't serve.
So it's a matter that they come out and the Congress confirms them anyway. We've
Maybe.
had issues with this justice before receiving gifts, if you remember his hearings. And what about Neil Gorsh? And is that just that is there no clearinghouse?
No, I think I'm comfortable with the hearing, with the confirmation process. Yeah, I don't like it. It's too. I would prefer they take it out of the public eye, and then they do these sorts of things that. No, I think the what turns into a scandal, it's not helpful. It's not helpful to us. It's a circus. Take it out of the public view, and then you can do a serious scrutiny of any kind of claims of ethical lapses or misbehavior. And I think then I'm confident that the process would take care of that. So yeah, I don't quite share your, I would guess we would look at Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearing and Brett Kavanaugh's hearings differently, you and I, right? I'm guessing we would simply assess them differently. I thought Kavanaugh's was I thought it was kind of a travesty, actually. So Thomas's was, I had other problems. Thomas shouldn't have been on the bench for lots of other reasons, right? He answered questions when asked about Roe v. Wade. He said he hadn't thought about it. He hadn't thought about abortion rights. That should have been disqualifying, right? Not he said, she said claims that couldn't be really litigated in public. So that's kind of where I come out. Yeah. We've got like 5 minutes. I don't want to go into the next topic. So yes, no, I don't want to. So we have 5 minutes of questions. Yes. Or I can repeat it, but okay. Well, and I always forget here, I know. Yes.
Have you been hearing that Clarence Thomas might be recusing himself from a case coming up? And how often, if that's true, how often does that happen among the chief justices?
Yeah, I did. I don't know details. I saw a headline and there was maybe a relation or something who had a connection to a case coming before him. So I can't speak to the particulars. I know it was recent. I saw the headline. I don't know the particulars of it. It happens. It doesn't happen frequently. There are some general kind of expectations. If you have stock holdings, right, and the company comes company is a litigant in an appeal that comes before the court, and you've got, right, your portfolio maybe has holdings of them, then that might be sort of a typical recusal. Right, there are kind of high profile cases that, and these tend to be controversial, I think, about sort of relationships, right, and kind of influence for someone who's buying a house from Clarence Thomas, or paying for his trips and that sort of thing. I don't think that justices are right. So typically what happens is you write, if somebody wants a justice off a case, they have to write a request that the justice recuse herself. Justices are not inclined to do it for those kinds of reasons. Scalia, in classic Scalia fashion, someone asked him to recuse himself in a case involving Dick Cheney, right? So Dick Cheney, vice president, he was chairing some committee. I forget what the committee was, and some work that came out of the committee ended up being challenged in court, kind of worked its way up, went to the Supreme Court. Whoever was challenging the work of the committee requested that Scalia recuse himself because he and Cheney had gone on hunting junkets before, wasn't that it? I think. And Scalia, in classic fashion, right, rather than doing a couple paragraphs, I'm fine. I wrote like a 28-page opinion. It's just, the guy can't, he can't walk by a fight that, that he doesn't want to take part in. So, it's, and we can talk more about it next week, but okay.
In regards to your term limits, and you said it could be done legislatively and not an amendment to the Constitution, if the law would pass and then get appealed up to the Supreme Court, now the Supreme Court has to make the decision. Do they have to all recuse themselves then?
Like, do you want me to answer that? I don't know. Yeah. Well, that was like the, Bush v. Gore. Like, there were certain ways that case could have come out where it was going to go to the Senate, and a 50-50 tie meant Al Gore, like president pro tem of the Senate, was going to decide, these hypotheticals. But that one actually could have happened. I don't know what'll happen there. So we're at it.
Your time is running out. It's 2:30. Thank you very much. It's been enlightening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week at the same time.
Good deal.
So thank you.
Okay.